Tim, I think it's time that we really hit hard with some of these controversial topics on Acre Insights, and one of them that gets brought up time and time again is regenerative versus organic. Are they distinct? Is there overlap? Is it all or nothing, one or the other? Are they both hype and not worth the trouble? And there's a lot here, and a lot of people have different opinions about it. But maybe let's start with you, Tim. Kind of how are you currently thinking about regenerative versus organic? Do you find yourself falling into a particular camp?
Yeah, in my mind, they're two very different things. Where with organic, that's kind of a proven blueprint. It has its own model. It has its own certification process. I think with regenerative, it's a totally different animal. It could have applications for both organic and conventional. It also hits a lot of different crop types, getting into the livestock, row crop, specialty crop. So I see them as two distinct, separate options. I was at the Organic Produce Summit last week. Had a good time in Monterey. I'll just kind of set the stage a little bit for the event, but it's a big trade show that happens in Monterey, California every summer, really bringing together the organic community. So you have every retailer across the US, and then major organic producers, grower, packer, suppliers, ag tech, and service providers as well. So really getting there to meet and connect. There's a trade show along with it where suppliers are pitching their new organic products to the retail community and vice versa. One of the sessions that I listened in on was Regenerative Agriculture 101 is regenerative the new organic. So it was kind of like a spicy title. Sat in on this panel. Is pretty interesting. The ESG director from Bolt House moderated the panel, and there was a guy from Bolt House and Braga Fresh, which is a leafy green shipper in Salinas, and then a stone fruit grower in the Central Valley, really kind of talking through what regenerative means for organic, and just an interesting context to hear about the regenerative movement being at an organic show. I feel like organic is really trying to own regenerative and kind of like layer it on top of organic, where they're just trying to like write the terms and make it almost as a add-on to organic versus a standalone, because obviously it's in their best interest if they can couple these two together. So I felt a bit of that, where they're trying to kind of paint both as the same when they're two totally different systems. Definitely felt that as they were trying to position it as an add-on. And I think they were like nervous about the outcome of it being separate from organic, and maybe growers that were typically organic maybe transition away and become regenerative, and maybe have a few conventional practices mixed in, and that's a better system for them. And so I think there's some hesitancy there. That being said, it's such an open sky for the space. Like with how much organic has grown the past 20, 30 years, it's still 1% of farmland that is organic. So it's so small. So it's, I think, a rising tide lifts all ships. We like to say that on the show type situation, where I think it's in everyone's best interest to grow the shares of both sides and get consumers on board with that. Another thing that stuck out was just kind of like in like predetermined view that organic is better for the soil and like already a regenerative system, where that's really not the case, where oftentimes in organic systems you have a lot of weed pressure. You don't have the chemical tools to combat that, and you're dealing with heavy tillage. And so that's obviously one of the no-nos of regenerative agriculture. So it's not like both systems are speaking the same language. Both have pretty adverse principles in certain instances. Another thing I found interesting was just kind of the mention of livestock, where livestock integration is a key tenet of regenerative agriculture. Wasn't brought up once during the show. And I think that's another challenge here, is you have all these producers that are growing fresh market crops, fruits and vegetables, and the food safety implications of having livestock next to fresh produce is a big no-no. So it's kind of selective with kind of what regenerative means. And I think they were just trying to kind of cherry pick what works in the organic context, and stuff that didn't was just kind of omitted. So it's going to be interesting to see where this conversation goes. But yeah, in my mind, Ty, just to recap, I view them as two different opportunities, and growers kind of taking one path or the other, where I think the regenerative organic thing is kind of being viewed as kind of packaging them together, but I do see both as standalone.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. I think what I see as a major challenge is the organic standard has risen to the top of what consumers really choose at the aisle, on the aisle, right? Consumers want organic, they trust organic. And that has created, I think, a major problem, because the organic standard has a lot of fundamental problems, and it's not the standards. It's not the standards fault for doing that. I think organic was really originated with all positive and aspirational purposes. But the fact is, like you mentioned, there is a lot of abuse of the standard, and the standard wasn't inherently written to solely promote soil health. Right? It was to reduce chemical usage, which is a noble pursuit. But because of where we're at, because it has risen to such a standard in consumers' eyes, I think people feel the need to piggyback regenerative on top of it, and like you mentioned, that creates this weird dynamic and this weird tension because you're often fighting these different principles, like you mentioned. And regenerative, on the other hand, has its own set of problems. Most notably, is there is no single standard, right? So there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of greenwashing that's happening. People are kind of using regenerative for their own, purposes of what sounds good to them or what they can implement, and so that has its whole host of problems too. And that's why I think people are like, well, can we take the best of both worlds, right? And I think in a perfect world, you take the trust and the experience of organic with the soil health benefits of regenerative, and you bring those together. That's kind of the best of both worlds. The worst of both worlds is that no one knows what's going on, and you have competing principles, and so farmers are put in a position where they're like going crazy trying to figure out which standard to prioritize at a given time. I think, Tim, you even saw a post on LinkedIn that really, really hit that home.
Yeah, I mean, just read from this post. It was from John Strophus, the founder and CEO of Field Theory. Really interesting post. But what he says here is a teachable moment. Organic farming does not automatically equal better soil health. Here's an example to share this reality. In this field, we had high weed pressure after organic sunflowers, even with cover crops planted in place in 2021. To control weeds and terminate the cover crop, we had to dig twice, then disc, and dig twice again prior to planting. This was all necessary to adequately prepare for planting success. We now have the weeds under control, which is vital in the organic system for future crop economic success. However, if this wasn't organic, this would have been a one spray event and one light digging event, or possibly a no-till planting, resulting in only the chemical spray. Instead, we had 5 major soil disruptions. So there are trade-offs with negative effects by not having chemical options. This is a hard reality for many who promote organics and criticize conventional farmers. We choose to farm in both systems, and neither are perfect.
Man, I we've struggled with that, right? Like we've had those conversations on our farm about how to prioritize, and that example makes so much sense, right? Like even the idea of terminating a cover crop, right? Like sometimes it makes most sense to terminate a cover crop chemically, but it depends on what your ultimate end goal is, and so I'm very interested to see how this all plays out. I think that regenerative organic, may make sense in maybe specific contexts, right? But I think the coupling of them or the marriage of them, it may be very hard to mass produce, right? To have across contexts, geographies, crop types. And so I think on our farm, right, like we're experimenting, right? We have 100 acres that are in transition to organic, but we're also experimenting with regenerative principles across the farm as well. And so we're following this closely, but I think there's just inherent tension between these two. I don't know if there's going to be a perfect solution that bring them both together. And I think that we will see more clarity on the regenerative side of, regenerative specific standards or crop specific standards, where this is how strawberries do regenerative, or this is how broccoli is grown regeneratively, because each crop kind of has specific requirements in place that, on the especially on the specialty side, is a little different from maybe some of the tried and true methods on the row crop side.
Yeah, good points, Ty. I mean, I think we're still early, as we also like to say on the podcast, but just the fact that this is coming up in conversation at organic trade shows, I think is interesting. Like you could probably rewind 20, 30 years, and that's when like organic was very fringe and nascent, like being discussed in trade shows. So it's starting to reach more people and have conversations about which I think is important. And now that more farmers are trying this, there's just more data and more case studies and more examples of this, of really weighing the pros and cons of the system and what's working and what's not. So it's all going to be a positive for the movement as a whole.
I think so, and I think it's going to come down to, what ultimately resonates with consumers, right? About, is it soil health, and is that going to be the thing with all of the benefits of soil health, right? Nutrient density, climate sequestration, water retention, all of these things that we talk about, is that what's really going to drive consumers to purchase regenerative products and to care about the soil, right? I think that's really the question. Or, is it is it going to be consumers just know organic, they want organic, right? And I think that's going to be really the driver of how all this shakes out.